Today's episode of the No Fun City podcast is brought to you by Questrade. There's a new world of investing where the fees are low and you come first. It's time to switch. Head over to questrade.com to check out do-it-yourself, self-directed investing. Take matters into your own hands, build your own investment portfolio with a self-directed account, and save on fees. Make your money work harder. Questrade is Canada's fastest growing online brokerage with over 21 years experience in the Canadian market, $18 billion in assets under administration, and a 9-time winner of the best managed companies in Canada. And you could rest assured knowing that your money is in good hands. They go above and beyond to protect your account with an additional $10 million in private insurance, so you know your money is safe. For more information, check out questrade.com. Just use the link in the description below. On to our show. Welcome to the No Fun City podcast, episode 20 or 21. We're unsure. We're going to find out, once this is edited, we'll figure out what episode this is. But today is a special episode, as always. I'm joined with a special guest, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Simon Fraser University, Dan Travers. What's up, Dan?
Well, it's funny, in academic and sort of other circles, I'm just going by Travers now, but I ended up being Dan Travers on Facebook for my electric unicycle thing, so I kind of have these multiple identities, which is really fun.
Okay, so your first and last name, though, isn't Dan Travers?
I just go by Travers. I'm trans, so I had a more typical name, and I started out by being Dan Travers on Facebook, which is how I made all my connections in the e-rider community. And then I decided in the rest of my life just to drop the first name entirely.
Mm-hmm. But you're originally, your birth name, for example, was?
You don't ask that of trans people.
Oh, okay.
Just a tip.
See, that's the thing. I'm completely out of the loop when it comes to the trans community.
Yeah.
So pardon my, I guess,
inexperience.
Inexperience and all. And that's also part of the reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast.
For sure.
Because I think it would be interesting to discuss some of those topics at hand, right? And as I said, if I overstep in any way, it's just because I'm unaware.
Yeah.
And I don't know what those boundaries or whatever are, what that respect level comes in from. But on my end, it's just more of curious to know or knowledge or just figuring out what it is that, how do you approach, I guess, somebody in the trans community without offending them, but still asking them questions about their life and their identity and things like that. So is there anything as far as that stuff goes that you do not want to talk about at all?
I'll just let you know as it comes up.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then can you explain also,
Sure.
if you let me know, can you explain to me why?
Yeah. For example, asking somebody what their name was before or their birth name in trans people refer to it as dead name.
Okay.
So, and so you're not supposed to, you aren't supposed to refer to someone by their dead name or ask them what it was.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Can just for the people who might be listening and not watching, may I ask, for example, the identity switch, for example, you go by non-binary, I know that much,
yes.
Right? But when we're talking I guess male to female, female to male, what's the situation there for the listeners who maybe want to get an idea?
I think the first thing for people to know is that there are more than two sexes, that this common sense understanding that there are only two sexes, that you're either born male or female, and it's always easy to tell, that's just not scientifically based at all. There's a lot of natural variation. But also the assumption that if you are born with what someone, decides are male, with male biology, that you are necessarily going to be a boy or masculine or that kind of thing. I mean, gender is a spectrum. There's sexual variation in among humans as well as, so many mammals is so normal. But, we have this long standing kind of heteropatriarchal belief that there are only two sexes and that boys and girls and men and women are fundamentally different. And if you're born a boy and you don't act like one, there's something wrong with you. Well, that's all. Like, that's none of that is true. So, I mean, there are some people who are what we call cisgender, which means that you were assigned male or female at birth and you're okay with it. Like, that just isn't an issue for you. You happily identify as a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. But so we use the term cisgender to refer to people who are not trans. Whereas,
so for example, who identify, for example, as a male, I am cisgender.
Correct. You are a cisgender male. Absolutely. Absolutely. But so some people are assigned male at birth, but are, identify as girls and eventually women. Some people are assigned female at birth and identify as boys and eventually men. And some people, like me, none of it works. Like, if I were to transition to a male identity entirely, it wouldn't really work. But being able to say, non-binary really works for me because I'm sort of, a combination of things. And every person who's non-binary understands what it means for them to be non-binary in their own way.
So, pardon this part of the conversation, because once again, it comes to my lack of knowledge and I guess not arrogance, but lack of knowledge here is like, okay, if we're talking science, you go to the hospital and you're having surgery or something, and they need to know, is this patient male or is this patient female? What would they then go by in a biological, scientific standpoint, where they need to know this person is of this biology? You called it a biology, correct? Right? So if we're in that situation, that was one aspect that I always never understood, was what happens when if you have to go to the hospital, or the hospital where they give you the form and they're like M or F, what happens when they need to know biologically for whatever reason, whether it be they need to give you something specific that is, for example, only females should be taking this, or only male biology should be taking this. What happens in those situations and circumstances?
Well, I want to start by saying most of the time when you're asked to check the M or F box, it's completely irrelevant. Okay. It used to be necessary, for example, to state your race on a driver's license. We now understand, how racist that is. Most of the time when you're asked to check M or F, it's completely irrelevant. It has absolutely nothing, it's just a way of organizing people in a way that is, quite oppressive. But the thing is that now that, we are more aware of trans issues, we know that, some men actually give birth, there are trans men who give birth or who breastfeed, that kind of thing. So I think the questions need to be more specific. Do you have a uterus? Do you have testicles? These kinds of things, because there are, women who were assigned female at birth who don't, there's incredible natural variation. So I think the questioning just needs to be more specific.
Okay.
And the circumstances under which it is necessary to ask, what sex or what gender you identify with are there aren't very many of those circumstances where that's a legitimate or fair question. Much as, it shouldn't be a relevant question. Let's say, as a professor, if someone, a student in my class, under what circumstances would it be appropriate for me to say, what race are you? Right? Especially as a white person. It totally makes sense to me if students, speak up and they say, well, as a South Asian person or as a black person or as an Iranian person, these are some of the experiences with prejudice and discrimination. that, people like me experience, and it's like unbelievably relevant. But to ask somebody to sort of provide these certain identifying characteristics generally, we're increasingly understanding that, it's not appropriate. And, the same is true for sex and gender. Obviously, if you are in the care of a healthcare professional, it may very well be necessary to have that information. But, just to give you an example, before I had top surgery, I had to go and have a mammogram. And the tech who was doing it, she started to ask all kinds of questions about the surgery that she did not need to know to perform her job.
Okay.
And she was asking them because she was curious, like in a way that made me uncomfortable. And I said, and she was saying, so do you? And I said, hey, these are not questions, or like, this is not information that you need to know. And I wasn't mad at her. I was just like setting a boundary. And this is where there needs to be better education. It's like, I understand that you're curious about this, but these are not, this is not information that you require for what we're here for today. And she went, oh, okay. So it's just like, I don't know, like, I never think that comparisons between race and gender are always, they're not always accurate, but I'm sure that you and many other people who are racialized in the Canadian context get asked questions like, where are you from?
Yeah.
And you say, Burnaby. And they say, no, where are you really from? Right? Which is a way of marking you as non-Canadian, non-white. Like it's a way in which it's a microaggression in which people sort of reinforce the idea that white people are the true Canadians, and anybody whose name is a little bit different, non-Anglo, or who, is visibly not white, is not from here.
Yeah. I moved, like, my family immigrated to Canada when I was 2 years old. I lived in Vancouver my whole life. I don't really know anything much about, like, Iran. I don't remember my experience there. But it's funny because even me growing up here for over 30 years of my life at a Vancouver Canucks game, not that I got into an altercation with some guy, but some guy was like a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, for example, sitting next to me as a Canucks fan, like at a playoff game. And the guy eventually, like after a couple tit for tats, told me to go back where I came from. And I just laughed out loud. He actually came back and apologized like later and shook my hand and was like, sorry, like heat of the moment thing. I get it, right, whatever. But I found it so hilarious that even I, as somebody who has lived here for over 30 years, have been told go back where you came from, just out of spite. It wasn't like, I don't blame the guy, and I don't think he was a racist or anything. I just think it was just one of those spur of the moment things. But yeah, it's interesting. But that being said, you are in an interesting dynamic because growing up, I don't know, and I mean, it might be different now. I don't know any school teachers or college professors or university professors, that are trans. So can you maybe describe a little bit about, and we are going to talk about other things, obviously, right? But I kind of want to get this cat in the bag because I'm sure even listeners have some of these questions
For
too.
sure.
Is what is it like being in the shoes of a trans individual who is a professor? Like, and has there been developmental change in the way people have reacted to that? Has it been positive? Has it been negative? Was it negative in the past and now it's positive? So, and also, I mean, that also, I guess, that dynamic depends on how long you've been in this situation for, right? So
one of the things I'd say is that the majority of trans people are invisible because it isn't safe for them to come out in their environment. So everybody, whether they're conscious of it or not, interacts with trans people all the time. They just don't know. And I say this, like, I wrote a book about trans kids that I published in 2018. And, one of the things that I say, because the book is really, it's like there are multiple audiences for the book, but one of the audiences is anybody who works with kids. And one of the things I say is the majority of trans kids are invisible. So anytime you work with children, you're working with trans kids. So if you can, create gender inclusive language and practices, there will be children who you will never know who are you not harming by doing this, as well as just, cis boys and girls to get the message that, they can like what kind of toys they like and like what kind of activities, and they can have friendships with people of all genders, and it doesn't have to be sexualized. Like, I think that's a healthy thing. But I mean, I have always been gender nonconforming. Like, I was a really queer kid.
Okay.
And, I, like, in my teens, even before, like, I was definitely, queer. Like, and, I sort of dealt with it by, like, living as a lesbian for a long time because, within lesbian communities, the way in which, you can be and your gender presentation is so much more varied, and that worked for a really long time. But as trans people have organized and created greater and greater acceptance, I mean, and partly, like, being a university professor is you live a charmed life. Like, I live, and which is really interesting for me it's one of the reasons why I like doing things in other environments and meeting people that I wouldn't meet there, because being a university professor is a very safe bubble. Like, I have not, knowingly been subject to, any kind of homophobic or transphobic discrimination. I think it also helps that, I'm transmasculine as opposed to transfeminine, because the way in which trans women are treated tends to be so much harsher. I
see that too.
Our culture celebrates masculinity so much that if you are given the gift of masculinity at birth and you refuse it, like, there's this, it upsets the whole apple cart of our culture, that people who are gifted with masculinity reject it. Whereas, people like me who are more masculine identified, well, it's understandable, like, we're going after the top prize. So, there's no question. But I mean, being a professor, it gives me phenomenal freedom. I mean, I get to do the kind of research that I want to do. I get to write, I get to teach, I get to, spark conversations that I think are important with students and, with people beyond the university. So it's pretty good. But even, it's even been an evolution, because I only dropped my first name in like the last year. And I think a lot of it sort of had to do with, just my own evolution, but also, having so much time over the COVID pandemic to just sort of, like, be able to take a step back from so much of my daily life and just sort of go, okay, I'm ready to do this. And, I thought, I'm also a youth baseball coach, and that's another area of my research. And, like, I think I felt like the last place I would ever be able to be trans was as a youth baseball coach. And I've done it this year. I've dropped my first name. I'm like, it's working out. And I didn't think it would ever be possible. And I'm not, I haven't, I don't know. I don't announce myself. I'm Travers. I just, I say to people who've known me for a long time, I'm not using my first name anymore. I'm just going by Travers now. And, I'm not really correcting people in youth baseball who, don't use they, them, their for me. If they use she, I'm just, for this time, I'm just letting that go, because I think, like, it's a lot. It's a lot in that world, especially the kids. But, most of the people are fine. Like, every once in a while they forget and they call me the other name. I said, I think you mean Travers. And they say, I'm sorry. I said, it's okay. If you changed your name, it would take me a while to adjust too. So, that's kind of going well. But, and in the electric unicycle world, I think the first time I realized it was possible, because I was Dan Travers on Facebook for a while. And when the first time I went to a different city to ride, I went, I did it through Facebook, and I just showed up as Dan. And it was this moment in the parking lot where I went, I can do this. Like, I can do this. So it's like the whole electric unicycle community has been a place where, like, I've found some space to be somebody that feels a little bit more like me. And I
Yeah.
remember after that first group ride, I mean, the people in San Diego were awesome. Like, one of the guys said, "Hey, this is the first time we've had a female rider." And I said, "I actually don't identify as female. I identify as trans non-binary." And the immediate response was, "Excellent. We've checked that box then." Like it was. And I think, so that was like one of my experiences that made me go, you know what? Like, I can actually be myself more fully than I've been allowing myself to be. And so, it's like life is good.
Yeah, so far so good. That was my thing, was I don't want to offend you ever by anything I say. So I'm always carefully thinking of how to word or how to say things or try to use the proper pronouns. I'll be honest, for the longest time, I didn't understand the pronoun thing, and I'll explain to you why. When pronouns first really became a thing, so in the trans community, I'm sure like it's been known about for a while or whatever, but when I first encountered it, it was like these young, like high school teenagers that are using like non-binary, whatever. Okay, all the power to you, but a part of me at the time was feeling like there's this select group of teenagers who are doing this just for the sake of saying they're non-binary, like it's a fad or it's a cool thing. So I, for that fact, didn't really understand it. I think it's more like balanced now. But did you find that was kind of the case at any point, or was I just off my rocker from being an outsider?
I think that particularly young people are dismissed when they express trans or non-binary identities, just because people don't really understand it. Where in fact, what they're doing is like in a lot of ways, young people have played a really significant role in developing new language about gender and new language about sexual identity. I mean, when I interviewed trans kids and youth, like they taught me a lot. Like they're very involved in creating more space for gender expression. I think it's often, like we often dismiss children and youth as, we don't take them seriously. And I think it's a huge mistake. Like there's this, adultism or ageism, when in fact, think about it. Like, it's not like everybody else is doing a very good job running the world. But if we sort of took our lead from young people about the way that we think and understand gender and sexuality, I think that it would create more room for everyone. But I think it's just very common to dismiss teenagers. Like we've created this category of the irresponsible teenager who, is, doing one thing and then another without any consistency. I mean, because one of the things teenagers are supposed to do, like at that developmental stage, is figure some things out. Like it's an opportunity. They're breaking away from, believing their parents and believing what adults tell them. And then they're finding that in many ways they've been lied to their whole lives, that the world is really, a much more complicated place. And, they're trying to figure themselves out. So I tend to have a lot more respect for youth.
Yeah.
And I do think that youth sometimes provide each other with greater space for exploring gender and sexuality. And some people become upset if somebody identifies as non-binary and then 2 years later they're saying, actually, this is where I am. But, the notion that we have to pick a gender and stick with it in order to be taken seriously. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could, be sort of in touch with our gender identity and allow it to change, because it often changes. I don't think it's static. Or the way that we even understand ourselves, like for people who identify as men, if you ask a 20-year-old what that means, and then, you were to teleport 50 years later, like they'd probably have a really different understanding of what it meant to be male, to be a man.
Oh, definitely, 100%. Okay, so going back on the study you were doing with trans children and the parents and stuff like that, let's talk a little bit about that, because I actually just recently in my family, I got a message from a family member, like a long sort of like email type of message. and telling us that their child now identifies as trans, or as, I guess they identify as a female, born what we generally would call male, born generally male, and transitioning or has transitioned to female. So now on my end, I also want to learn a lot more about this, because now it's affecting, well, not affecting, but it's part of family dynamic, right? The first individual that I know of, at least, in my family dynamic to have or to be trans and to openly come out as trans. Kudos on them and that whole family for like figuring out that dynamic early. I think the parents also did a great job, because they let their kids be whatever they wanted to be, in the sense that like they let her, like what is now her, dress however they wanted, like wear whatever they wanted, play with whatever they wanted. And they were very supportive, like you could tell they were very supportive of this. Now, obviously, the rest of the family had no idea that, yes, this child was, whether it be gay or straight or bi or whatever, or trans or whatever it may be, right? But, you know, the notion was kind of like, there were signals, I guess, that something was different, quote unquote. See, these are things that I don't even know if I could use the word different, because this shouldn't be a thing of difference, right? But what I want to know, and what they did tell me, or write in the email, was that like apparently children identify their sexuality like quite early on in the developmental stage. And I know you did studies on parents and trans children and stuff like that. So are there any dynamics that you could tell us about the study that you did that may relate to these trans children and the dynamic of the parents, but also as far as the developmental stage of identifying as somebody from a different sex orientation that you were born with? I think I worded that.
Yeah, there's a lot to answer there. The first thing I'd say is that somebody's gender is different from sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who you are sexually attracted to.
Okay, yeah.
So, you know, we're not usually thinking about that with 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, but there are 2-year-olds who know that they know what sex they are, like whether they're a girl or a boy. And one of the things I'd say is that, you know, what a child plays with or doesn't play with, you know, what music they like, that is not an indication of their gender. That is just simply what they like. If you go to a children's clothing store, you know, you see, like, it's very difficult to get gender neutral clothing. If, you know, you're assigned male at birth, you know, you're supposed to be wearing the trucks and the hockey sticks and the baseball and the sports, or it's girl, the flowers and the stuffies and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's pretty oppressive. But I mean, there are all these assumptions that boys and girls are naturally different, but we put so much cultural effort into teaching children that there are only 2 sexes, and this is what you are, and this is what you need to like and dislike. So that as a backdrop. But I mean, the most constructive thing that parents can do is, you know, what your family member parents did, which is to, you know, like, support them in liking what they like and, you know, playing with what they want. I mean, that's a really good response. Some people identify as trans in their 60s, and like they really don't have an awareness of it before then. And there were kids in my study who were asserting that they were girls when they were 2.5. Like, they had absolute clarity, and it never changed. You know, and there were some who were asserting that one kid who was asserting herself as a girl until she was 14, and you know, as a result of her interaction in online trans communities and getting to know what the options were, said, you know, I still identify as trans feminine, but I think I'm more non-binary, and wouldn't it have been great to know that there were so many more options? Because children often live in a world where there aren't those options. Like, how many, you know, I think about the kids that I work with in coaching baseball, and I am very possibly the first trans person they have ever interacted with knowingly. And I just think, wouldn't it be great if kids knew, and I'm happy, I have a good life, like, wouldn't it be great to know that there are all different kinds of people who, and some of us are nice people and some of us are obnoxious people, and it doesn't have anything to do with our gender, but wouldn't it be great to have a sense of, greater opportunity, like for kids to know that the possibilities are so much larger than, what they get told the vast majority of the time. But the thing that, parents need to do more than anything is follow their child's lead. Like if a kid says, I'm a girl, and you didn't think that, well, then you just say, thanks for telling me, and proceed. Like, and
Yeah.
sometimes they'll try it out for a while, and you don't need to not do it because, well, maybe this isn't serious. It's like, try it out. Like if they say, I'm a girl, just go with it. Say, no, this is my daughter, that kind of thing. And if, 2 years later they say, I really feel in between, or this isn't working for me, then you just adapt. Because one of the things we know is that the worst damage you can do is to make it very clear to a child that you are not okay with who they are asserting themselves to be. And in many cases, parents and family members and community members do this without knowing that they are interacting with a trans kid, but they are signaling very clearly, that it's not safe for them to be who they are. And that's really awful.
Yeah. And this could actually extend to even outside of trans children to like LGBT, like the whole LGBTQ realm, right?
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I was at a bus stop one day, like I was just riding my electric longboard, and we're going to get into the electric mobility stuff as well, like down the road, but I figured we would conquer this part of the conversation early on. I was just riding my electric longboard, and usually when I do that, I take the bus back home, like up the mountain. So I'm waiting at the bus stop, and there is what at the time I think is a mother and son sitting together, like at the bus, just waiting for the same bus as me. And the son has his legs sort of part, like kind of just sitting like male, like kind of like sprawled.
Man
sort
spreading.
Of like wide, man, yeah.
Man spreading. Taking up space.
Taking up all the room, yeah. And I overhear the mom like tell what I thought was a son, but also the way that they were dressed was very masculine. Okay, I'll say that much, right? Tell them, oh, like, why do you sit like that? Like like a lady sits with crossing their legs, or like this. And I kind of was like, what is going on? And I look over and I realize, I'm like, oh, like what I thought was a male, like a son, was actually the daughter. Okay, so a female. Okay, but clearly me even just observing, and maybe I am jumping to conclusions, but from my observation, it was clearly somebody who was having a difficult time in their life, like identifying with their gender.
Or they're just gender, like rather than looking at it as difficult, to say they're gender nonconforming.
Yeah, sure. See, these are the terms that I have. This is why I'm always so careful about how I approach my conversation, because I'm like, I don't want to seem like I'm offending anybody by saying these things, or I'm wrong, or I don't know what, right? But I found that so offensive that the mother was trying to adjust this child, and clearly like the child wasn't having it. The child kind of looked at the mom awkwardly. Then you could tell the child was feeling awkward because I was there too, and I'm hearing this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just like, but obviously, like, I'm cool with it. Like, I don't care. Like, be yourself. Like, if that was my kid, I wouldn't be saying those things. But I found that the mother was trying to conform them to that female gender. And even though the mother probably knew that there was this element that they didn't want to have, or they weren't used to, they were trying to adjust and manipulate through just the way the child would be positioned, the things that they would do, being ladylike, things like that, right? The clothes that they would wear probably being more like female clothes, right? Put on a dress, or something like that, right? So So that's one interaction that I saw publicly that was between a mother and a child that was clearly like in some sort of like gender crisis or just that developmental stage of unknown, right?
Yeah,
or trying to figure themselves out.
It sounds like the kid was fine.
Yeah.
The mother is the one with the problem.
On the other hand,
but let's even talk about the sexism of that.
Okay.
It's like even if the kid was, like conforming to gender norms, as a girl, and being told, girls are constantly being told to take up less space. Whereas, boys and men are really encouraged to take up more space. So, like I would, if it was my son and, there was a limited space on the bench and he was sprawling and taking up space, I'd go, dude, you're taking up more than your share of space. That's how I would, it wouldn't be about gender. It's like, dude, you're taking up more, and if my daughter was doing that, I'd say, sweetie, you're taking up more than your share of space, right? Mm-hmm. Like, rather than this, because girls get told to take up less space. They're supposed to barely eat, be as small as possible. They're not supposed to be loud. They're, whereas boys are more encouraged to take up space. So, you have the basic sexism. But in the case of, the kid who is gender nonconforming, you have the really toxic effort by the parent to, to shame the kid into conforming. And the fact that they did it, in front of somebody else is really, like the kid was probably working really hard to be cool as if nothing hurt, but it probably was like acid.
Yeah, you could tell on their face. I mean, I tried to make it as less uncomfortable as possible, but even I was uncomfortable for the child in that situation.
Yes.
So the thing that I did was I just played it normal. Like I wasn't listening and I don't care, like none of my business and whatever, right? But in the back of my head, I kind of really had like I want to scold the parent in a sense of like, why would you do that to your child? Like, and how often are you doing that if you're doing it at a bus shelter in front of me?
Oh my God.
Like what is that? And you could just see the sort of like, the weight on that child's shoulders from that aspect of their life alone.
Yeah.
And I think that's truly, truly difficult. But going back on the study that you did itself, like what did that study encompass? Like, was it just trying to get to know the minds of children who are in that state?
I interviewed like in total about 30 trans kids and or maybe another 20 parents of trans kids. And I just asked questions about their gender identity and, things about their lives. And, one of the things that I think might surprise people who don't really sort of travel in queer and trans communities is that, like, being queer and trans, like, is pretty fabulous. It's like, it's not like, oh, I wish I could be just like everyone. There are trans kids who literally do not want to be part of anything special. They're girls, for God's sake. Could they just live as a girl? Or they're boys? Could they just live as a boy? But, many of us, like, just absolutely cherish our queer and trans communities because, the drudgery and misery of heterosexuality and straight gender is just so boring and horrible, if you could say, okay, could you be born a boy or something like that, or or something like that, would you have done it? I say no, because in spite of the fact that, certainly my childhood was pretty miserable around gender because my parents were really upset. That I failed to conform, and it was not pleasant. But I mean, the creativity, the fun. I mean, like for me, I've gotten as much out. Like I've gotten way more out of being queer and trans than any negatives I've experienced for being queer and trans. And like talking to kids, like if you think about it, there's so much effort that goes into telling kids there are only two sexes and this is who you are and this is what this means. You're talking to kids who reject this from a young age. What incredible people. Like, think about it. Like, imagine what it would be like to be 3 years old and be going, I is a girl. And, initially everybody no, you're not, and just insisting. Like, that's an incredible person. Somebody who just does not accept the status quo at all. Like, an incredibly courageous and resilient person. And so, it's really easy to think of trans kids and trans young people as victims and as oppressed, which, they certainly get a lot of shit. But they're also incredibly courageous, gutsy people who have a vision of the possible that is so much bigger than the environment that they emerged in. And that is pretty exciting. So I talked to some pretty amazing kids. And I also talked to some kids whose survival I'm really worried about. But I definitely talked to so many kids who just refuse to go along with things. And you think, wow, like, pretty cool. And I've also talked with parents who did something that my parents could never have done. They listened to their kids. Okay. Their kids said, I'm a girl. And the parents, many of whom had no background in queer or trans issues. Like, these are like your straight, white parents, Christian, whatever, never thought about this. But they loved their kids. And their kids told them something, and they heard them, and they listened, and then they went out and they educated themselves. And they became unbelievable advocates, not just for their kids, but for trans kids more broadly. And it's pretty inspiring.
Definitely. Sorry, I had my mic on mute there. The thing that I have a difficult time understanding, and we get into this too, because you deal with sort of like a sports element of this, correct? Right. And we saw recently on the news, I'm sure you've seen it, is that from New Zealand, there's going to be the first trans in the female weight class of weightlifting.
Laurel Hubbard.
Okay. Yes. And like, awesome news, obviously, for the trans community, because obviously it's a step forward, right, in what would be the right direction. But when it comes to sports, we have like this sort of like borderline and two sides of it. On one side, we need inclusivity. We need to be included, right, as trans people, And on the other side, we're like, okay, cool story, but you were a weightlifter in men's category back when, and now you're going to compete with females. How is this fair for the females when we know body structure wise, there is a difference, especially in upper body form? So like, what's the take on the trans community when it comes to stuff like this? But then also, I'm going to throw a curveball. Is the answer to have these trans individuals compete within these two like male-female category, or is the solution to just have sort of like either a co-ed or a trans category, or maybe there needs to be like a an Olympics like directed towards trans people, much like, but then is that segregating them? You know what I mean? There's so many elements that come to my mind, because I'm of the one that thinks, yeah, it's unfair. I truly think it's unfair that somebody, in two senses. I think it's unfair that somebody can't compete, right, as a trans individual. But then I also think it's unfair that they get to compete in the female category if they were a male. I don't know if that offends you in any way, but I wanted to get your side of that too, as somebody in this realm that identifies non-binary.
Yeah, the participation of trans people in sport is one of my areas of scholarly expertise.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, I start by talking about is the two-sex system is a cultural product. It isn't based in reality. And we see how, this becomes very obvious with things like female eligibility testing, where, there's an arbitrary line about who is considered sufficiently female in order to compete in female categories. And I think one of the things that's really important to emphasize that even as the International Olympic Committee and the International Athletic Association, IAAF, even as they made these, like they had these procedures for sex verification testing, the leading scientists in the field objected to them as unscientific all the way along.
Okay.
All the way along. The leading scientists in the field said these are unscientific.
Okay.
And that has not changed. So you see, and right now we're on, like so many nanomoles of testosterone is the normal range for women. And yet there are some women whose natural levels of testosterone are higher than the normal range. But for men whose natural levels of testosterone are not higher than the normal range for men, they're still allowed to compete against men. So you're going, what? But, first of all, we have to remember modern sport was a masculine product. And one of its purposes was to differentiate between men and women. At the turn of the century with the Industrial Revolution, women were getting more power. And sport was one of the ways to go, to create a masculine preserve and to normalize masculine leadership and gender inequality. So you have all this happening. Women weren't allowed to do a lot of sports initially. The argument was that they would damage their reproductive organs by participating in sport, which is really weird when you think that, men, cis men, their reproductive organs are on the outside and much more vulnerable. But, it doesn't need to be logical or rational, right? Right? So the thing is, the things that we do, the way that we organize society, that we claim is scientific, it often isn't, and it certainly isn't with the case with sports. So we start by having deeply problematic this whole sex segregation in the first place, which was mostly to exclude women. And now, as a result of women's organizing, there have been more, this more participation, but creating a separate category for women. There are pros and cons to that because, I believe if you made sport all gender right now across the board, that you'd see a drop-off in girls and women participating because those environments would be so toxic. But at the same time, you have this arbitrary divide between people who are, categorized as men and people who are categorized as women. Or, in the case of international sport organizations, people who meet the criteria to participate in women's categories and people who don't. And right now, the criteria is it's gone from 10, a measure of 10 nanomoles of testosterone to 5. So if you, in order to compete in women's events, you have to have hormone levels of below 5 nanomoles of testosterone.
Okay.
And there isn't scientific consensus about whether or not this is an appropriate line. This is just the latest thing that they're doing. So, Laurel Hubbard will she will, in order to compete, she will have that same hormone level.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting what we consider to be fair versus unfair advantage. I mean, there are lots of cis women who are ridiculously tall.
Yeah.
And yet, they're not saying, well, if you have a certain kind of skeletal development, you don't get to compete in the women's category. So it has to be fair across the board. Or, you think about all the things that go into making somebody a world champion athlete. Think about all the kids who don't even have adequate nutrition. Not to mention, who don't get involved in sports because their parents can't afford it or can't, they don't have the time to take them to things. Think about all the things that goes into producing an elite athlete. What's fair, what's unfair? These are social decisions. So I think that, this whole idea of saying, well, Laurel Hubbard is still really a man because, she had past exposure to testosterone. And one of the things I want to emphasize is the science, there is not scientific consensus, but there's certainly a disproportionate amount of science supporting the fact that, whatever advantage results from post-pubertal exposure to higher levels of testosterone, like it's gone in 2 years.
Okay.
Like it's gone.
In an ideal world, though, if you, for example, could help lead the committee of, this is how the Olympics are going to run from nowadays, or this is how sports and athletics are going to run with the trans community or the non-binary even community, what would be the ideal solution? Because the way I wrap my head around it is there's no solution within tossing people into male category and female category. I feel like there just needs to be that third category that's co-ed, for example. Like you've got, or even maybe like you eliminate the male and female and it just becomes like co-ed, but then then the males are competing with the females and that's not fair, right? Like in general, I'm talking like strictly like the two sexes.
Yeah. Okay, let me tell you what I would do, because I've obviously given this a lot of thought. One of the things that I would do first off is I would make it illegal to have male-only sports. Like the NHL. I mean, Haley Wickenheiser should have played in the NHL.
Okay.
Like it should be illegal. Like, major sports should have to show that they, like Major League Baseball, my thing is baseball. Like, Jose Altuve, who's been the MVP more than once, he's 5'6". Hank Aaron, who prior to Barry Bonds overtaking him was the home run king. Hank Aaron believes that women can play Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, it's totally sexist exclusion. Girls are systematically discouraged from playing baseball, and they are not provided with the same opportunities. They're streamed into softball, and if they continue to play baseball, they don't get the same opportunities at all. So I would say that I would make it illegal to have male-only sporting spaces. Kobe Bryant also argued that there were women in the WNBA who would be holding their own in the NBA right now. So there's this incredible overlap. So I would immediately say that male only, it's illegal, just like whites only. Like we're past it. But
so then in that case, should it just be everything co-ed?
No, I wouldn't. Okay. Because right now, one of the things we know, if we just introduced all gender right now across the board, you would see the disproportionate advantage that boys and men have over time expressing itself, but also it would be a really toxic environment for a lot of girls and women. I mean, like when I played lesbian softball, for example, compared to, in a gay league, there's always some guy who's like jumping in front of you to make the play, or they won't pass you the ball. So like making it all gender without doing like the long-term cultural work to end misogyny and sexism would just... So what I would do is I would have, an all-gender category, which was formally male only, but it would have to be like all gender, and I would maintain sporting spaces and categories for girls and women with trans-inclusive boundaries.
Okay. But another solution that I had was you have not to categorize them in like C being the lowest level or anything, but having the competitors, like let's say the runners, right? Even in like NASCAR or something like that, they do their qualifying run, right? Which tells them what place they're going to line up in on the course, right? So, and even they do it in the Olympics, like they have qualifiers, right?
Or golf, you have handicapping systems.
All qualifiers, right? So in the qualifying, you qualify for category A, B, or C. And like A is, for example, whoever they are, whether they be male, female, non-binary, trans, or whatever, there's like the 20 people that are going to be in the A category. Those are the 20 people who did the fastest lap time, for example. Yeah. Then there's the B category, just like they do with soccer, for example. You have the A team and the B team, for example. Then the B team is the next 20. The C team is the next 20, or the C players would be the next 20. Like that was the only sort of method that I came up in my head that was like, okay, that could work because everyone's still mixed in the same pool, but the alphas are alphas, right? The betas are betas, and the gammas and deltas are gammas and deltas, but they're still available and they're still capable to get into the alpha should they be able to qualify for that. Yeah. And that way you have your scale. because everybody is placed and everybody has a role, has a place, and then they're competing within their grouping where it's a fair competition. So I think you're right on the fact of, get rid of sort of like the male and kind of female, but then structure it in an ABC thing, but not making C like, oh, you guys are lower level than us. C is just the category of this thing. And I developed that from essentially MMA. Mixed martial arts does a good job of having female competitors. They're actually one of the
boxing, they have weight classes.
Yeah,
there are all kinds of precedences in sport where there are handicap systems that aren't based on sex. And you also have examples of sports where women were doing too well, so they sex segregated them, like women in shooting in the Olympics. Women were winning. So what they did is they made them sex segregated, and they changed the target system so there was no possibility of comparing performance.
Okay.
Right? And I think we really have to get over the idea that fairness is, a significant component in national and international sport, because the more we learn, the more it's not fair. And as I mentioned, there's also things like nutrition and opportunity and coaching. But I do think that in children's sport, what I would like to see is, I think that we should really focus on all gender sport for children, because it doesn't make any sense. When my son was 6, he wanted to play soccer. I could not find a mixed, why, I had to put him in all boys, and he's really competitive. He really wanted to play hard, but there are girls who could kick his ass. So, it makes no sense at all. But, in addition to having all gender sporting environments for boys and girls, you'd also have to have really good coaching leadership to undermine the kind of sexism that kids participate in too. But I think that would be really positive. Rather than separating kids and, we teach kids that boys and girls are different, when in fact they're really not so different. And even among adults, the normal variation between men or among men is way greater than the variation between the average man and the average woman. It's what do we choose to look at? What kind of when do we look at difference? When do we look at similarity? A number of people who study the science of sex development argue that the science of sex difference would be more appropriately called the science of sex similarity. The brain science type stuff. There's a woman named Rebecca Jordan Young who wrote a book called Brainstorm. And what she did is she took the brain science of the day about, the whole men and women have different brains, and she subjected it to scientific critique, and she discovered it was not scientific. They went in looking for something, and they ignored things that, should have been attended to so that they could say, this is different. And yet, you subject those tests, their methods to scientific scrutiny, and they were very unscientific. They were based on the expectation that they were going to find significant sex difference, when in fact they didn't find it at all.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that really, honestly, that puts a lot of stuff into perspective. And I think you're right. Just like boxing and MMA has weight classes, I think that's the lead that, or the route that the Olympics should take, is just have classes, outside of just male, female, it's just classes.
Yeah.
You get into whatever category you qualify for. And if you don't qualify, you're out. It doesn't matter if you're male, female, non-binary, trans, whatever. Everyone has the same playing field, right? That is the ideal way to go. And I got to give I watch mixed martial arts and UFC a lot. I think they do a good job of both. They include male and females. Obviously, there's no real transgender category, transgendered individuals.
Fallon Fox is a trans.
Oh, woman. Yeah, that's right. But she's not in the UFC.
No, they didn't let her.
So top tier, yeah. But you are correct.
No, they wouldn't let her. That was total transphobia.
Yeah. So the thing is if you have the classes, well, let's go back to the UFC real quick. They do a really good job of highlighting both males and females, for example, where the WNBA doesn't get, as you said, as much hype as the NBA or as much vision. When there's a UFC event, It doesn't matter who's on the card. It's mixed between males and females, and you're seeing female fights on the same card as male fights, and it's not like one or the other. Of course, there's Invicta, which is all female, right? But at this point, like, you're right, we're missing that element of the non-inclusive, which is still, there's no trans involvement into this situation, into these sports. I think that is honestly only a matter of time, but I think we are onto something when we say classes versus men and female, because that's when it gets tricky. When you say men versus female, then you're starting to play the dynamic, well, who's in this category, who's in that category? Whereas if you go based on like A, B, and C, and the top 20 are A, the next 20 are B, and the next 20 are C, whatever pool you fall in is what you fall into, it now becomes more broad, and there is no limitation because you could be any of each, right? And I think that's one of the best routes to go. The problem is the Olympics and these sporting committees, they don't jump on the bandwagon of change, they jump on the bandwagon of a transition, right? So, okay, well, now we're going to do this slow element of, okay, well, trans female can weightlift, in the female category, right? But like, instead of changing the actual dynamic of the system itself, like the system in place, the structure in place itself, they are just changing the slight elements to the rules around what they've already constructed.
Like the sex segregated structure of the sport is not transformed. They just, create like rules so that, if you're a trans woman, you can now compete. The problem is, though, that creates another unequal dynamic, because access to trans affirming healthcare is incredibly uneven. I mean, if you live in the United States and you don't have really good insurance, forget it. So you see an incredible disparity in who is able to compete, because, like accessing affirming healthcare, the hormone regime is like unbelievably expensive. Like you eliminate a whole category of people, like just people who are poor. And we know that in the United States and Canada, poverty is racialized. So the trans athletes who are going to be able to compete in these, slightly with the modified rules are going to be the most privileged.
Yeah. What do you say to people who say, too bad, so sad? Like, you choose to be trans, or you choose to live that lifestyle. Why does everyone else have to conform to this small, and I say small group, not being that it is a small group, but that these people will identify with it as a small group of people who just feel like they're out of the loop, but I don't understand you, and you're just, like not in the right space. I've heard it sometimes that people say, oh, these people are just confused. They're just confused. They got a lot going on in their lives, if they had a traumatic experience. So they're just confused, and it doesn't matter. So what do you say to people who have that totally right, I don't even want to say right wing, because I'm sure there's right wing people who agree with transgender. They maybe not so primary, but
Caitlyn Jenner is very
not
right
overly
wing.
But if we're going overly right, super conservative, maybe even super religious, what do you say to those kind of people?
Well, I mean, like there's this long history in, the West of categorizing people into who counts and who doesn't. And we know so well who has been, if we needed any more proof, for example, in the Canadian context, that Indigenous people have been categorized as not mattering, the recent confirmation of what Indigenous people have telling us all along about how many children were killed or died in residential schools. Like, body counts are the biggest example of who doesn't count. And, like that's just, so this is just another example of that. You have like racist white supremacist people who say, well, Indigenous people aren't really human. We need to get rid of them. They're in the way. They're standing in the way of us and our rights and progress. You certainly see it with the history of slavery and ongoing racial inequality in Canada and the United States. Like whose lives actually matter? Well, so you have the same kind of dynamic saying, oh, if you're trans or if you're queer, you're different from us. Like, we don't care about you. You don't matter. It's that same kind of thing. And I don't know about you, but I don't believe that it's appropriate to decide which categories of people deserve support and resources and which don't. Because anytime this happens, it's so evil. I mean, it's just so unbelievably evil. And, generations later, people go, oh, my God. But, at the time when Indigenous children were being literally abducted by the RCMP and forcibly confined in residential schools where many of them died and were abused, people knew about it. And there were people who were saying, this shouldn't be happening. And, people just, oh, savages, they're not civilized, it just doesn't matter. So, do we not learn anything from that? Do we not, so if we're going to turn that same view of trans people and just, put the problem, they are the problem, so it doesn't matter what happens to them, it's like it's part of something bigger, and, it's just not something that I'm willing to accept.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Of course, as I said, when it comes to non-binary and trans sort of culture, I am out of the loop. But that doesn't mean that I'm not understanding and that I'm not willing to understand.
Yeah.
The answer is, or the fact is that I don't have the facts that I need to get me there. Okay. So I see, for example, or I would have seen the end of the road or whatever, but I don't know the path that gets there, and I don't know all the facts. So I just go based on my own assumption of that's not fair because, this trans individual used to compete in this other weight class for men, and now what if they're just doing this to get a gold medal because they couldn't do it from the,
oh my
stuff
God.
like that goes through your, I know, but stuff like that from an outside perspective does go through your mind, right? So I feel like the awareness and the fact providing, so when I speak with you, for example, it provides me with a lot of knowledge that, for example, I may not have considered.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm a fairly liberal person. I consider myself trans inclusive and fair game, not just for trans people, but for straight people as well. I want it to be fair for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So I don't even come with it from an angle of it's these people have to be included and these people have to not be included. I come of it from a perspective, how can we include everybody and make everybody happy?
Yeah.
Right?
What would a world where everyone felt safe and valued look like?
Mm-hmm. And the only way to do that is to have conversations like this with people who are on the other side of the fence, for example, or the opinion that you don't know, that you didn't understand before. And I think for example, 10, 20 years ago, trans culture, although it was around, it wasn't in your face as much, or you couldn't find more information about it. With the internet and the social media and also different platforms and groups and forums, you could find more communities, online communities, for example, where people can sort of communicate to each other and as well as also get advice from each other or learn from each other. That wasn't around in 1990 or earlier, right?
No.
So there was a lot of people who hid, for example, the fact that maybe they felt outside of their classified gender, right? And sort of kept it to themselves, or didn't have a way to sort of, express themselves properly without worrying about how they're going to be judged.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was the exact polar opposite of that, where there were people who were trans openly and didn't care what random people thought, as they should, live your life, right? Now we're in an era of time where we can communicate throughout the world with everybody and with different, backgrounds as well as different orientations and such, where you can get those answers easily. Right?
More so, but the Christian right is also mounting a huge anti-trans campaign. So,
but there's also on the other side of that, there's also people who now advocate against religions, right? Saying like, screw Christianity, screw Catholicism type of thing, right? Especially now with what we've just recently found out.
Yeah,
right?
Like now is not a good time to...
So now it's like, in my opinion, neither of those, like, of course what has happened is horrible, but like, you can't blame every Catholic person, like individual, right? Someone who has a religion, you can't be like, you can't be Catholic, look what they do. Well, I didn't do that, but I believe in this set of rules that are in a book, for example, right? Like, I'm not going to hate on every Catholic or every Christian or whatever, just like I'm not going to hate on every trans person, because I judge everybody as the individual. You could be a Christian and commit murder, but you could also be a trans person who commits murder, for example, right? Like it's the human being, not the collective of a group that you classify someone in just because they do that, right? But you're right. We have a long way to go, I think. Like, it's a long road. Yeah. But it's a road that's being cleared slowly but surely.
And one of the I think real factors, like there has been an emergence of trans people as a social movement in, from the 70s in, a lot of Western countries. But I also think that just there have been parents of trans kids who have been really big change makers. Whereas parents in the past were really just really encouraged to submit their kids to conversions therapy, to really abusive practices to make them conform to gender norms. I think that, in the last, 20 or 30 years, there are parents who've just refused to do it. And, some of these really powerful change makers are white, middle, and upper class moms.
Oh.
And
that's random.
Well, because, no, it isn't. Because they're moms of trans kids. And, trans and queer people haven't until recently had access to schools, to school boards, to education curriculum, because of the, the false equivalence between queer and trans people and, sexual abuse of children, which is, predominantly by a landslide committed by heterosexual men known to the children. But, but white, middle, and upper class moms they're non-threatening. They have the resources, they have the cultural capital to advocate for trans kids in schools, and I think that they've been listened to. They have used their non-threatening and yet empowered position to advocate not just on behalf of their own children, but on behalf of trans kids and trans adults. I've seen a real, the whole parent movement has been really significant.
That's awesome. Yeah. For change, at least.
It is. I think
it's positive.
It's played a huge role. And, some of these women are lawyers or married to lawyers, and it's like, holy shit, they can fight.
That's crazy. That's good to hear, though. Yeah. That's good to hear. Obviously, the ball is rolling. It just needs to, keep rolling, and eventually we will get there, right?
Yeah, because prior to this, it was all on the shoulders of queer and trans people themselves to fight systems of oppression. But it is this huge movement of parents of trans kids who brought a totally different power base to the movement.
Travers, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is the end of the No Fun City podcast, episode 20. Peace out. Today's episode of the No Fun City podcast is brought to you by Questrade. There's a new world in investing where the fees are low and you come first. It's time to switch. Head over to questrade.com to check out do-it-yourself, self-directed investing. Take matters into your own hands, build your own investment portfolio with a self-directed account, and save on fees. Make your money work harder. Questrade is Canada's fastest growing online brokerage with over 21 years experience in the Canadian market, $18 billion in assets under administration, and a 9-time winner of the best managed companies in Canada. And you could rest assured knowing that your money is in good hands. They go above and beyond to protect your account with an additional $10 million in private insurance, so you know your money is safe. For more information, check out questrade.com. Just use the link in the description below.